Rick Ross didn't drop an album. Rick Ross dropped a receipt. And by the time the receipt hits the counter, everybody in the room realizes the bill was never for Rick Ross. The bill was for 50 Cent. The bill was for Drake. The bill was for Gunplay. The bill was for a manager named Kaso, whose daddy sat in a courtroom and did the one thing the street code says a man never does. And the twist nobody in the culture wants to admit out loud tonight is this. The person paying that bill in blood, in bars, in bruised ego, is not the person Rick Ross named on the record. The person paying is the person Rick Ross refused to name. And once you see who that is, you cannot unsee it. You will listen to Set in Stone a second time and hear a completely different album. Okay, so let me walk you through this, because every podcast, every reaction channel, every blog is telling you the same recycled headline. Rick Ross diss 50. Rick Ross diss Drake. Rick Ross flu commercial. Ha ha ha. Rick Ross is broke. Rick Ross is washed. Rick Ross is ducking. That's the surface. That's the appetizer, not the plate, because Rick Ross has been in this game for 20 summers. Rick Ross does not stumble into a headline. Rick Ross architects headlines the way Rick Ross architects verses. Slow, methodical, etched, permanent, set in stone. That's the whole thesis of the album. Rick Ross literally told you the thesis in the title, and everybody skipped past the title looking for a body. Now hold on. Before we get into the receipts, lock this into your head, because this is a frame that unlocks the entire album. Every disc on Set in Stone is a decoy. Every single one. The 50 Cent line is a decoy. The Drake line is a decoy. The Champagne Poppy reference is a decoy. The Epstein list bar is a decoy. Rick Ross is running a magician's misdirection at the exact moment the culture thinks Rick Ross is running out of moves. And I am about to prove it to you line by line, receipt by receipt. Let's rewind. Set in Stone drops. Rick Ross opens a promo swinging. Rick Ross is down and refuses to squash the 50 Cent beef when asked point blank. Rick Ross says the streets are the streets, and the numbers are fake, and the marketplace is flooded. Rick Ross says Rick Ross could see it in the interviewer's eyes that the interviewer might want to be Rick Ross. Rick Ross calls the man Flick Floss. That's not a diss at 50. That's a diss at the entire idea that anybody in the room is qualified to measure Rick Ross. Rick Ross is not defending an album. Rick Ross is defending a category, and Rick Ross is the only entry. Then the record itself lands. Mahogany caskets. And there it is, plain as day, no metaphor, no coded bar. Yo, F 50 Cent simple. Direct. 15 years of feud compressed into 3 words. And of course the internet loses its mind. But look at who Rick Ross put on the record next to that line. Ty. Not Jeezy. Not Wayne. Not Meek. Ty. A man who has publicly, repeatedly, and recently taken shots at 50 Cent. Rick Ross is not just throwing a punch. Rick Ross is assembling a coalition. Rick Ross is telling 50 Cent, look around. This is not a two-man conversation anymore. This is a room, and you are not in it. And then Rick Ross drops a line that broke the internet in half. F your baby mama, just for 4 songs from 23. Now the whole culture is trying to decode that lyric like it's the Rosetta Stone. Some say it's literal. Some say it's revenge for what 50 Cent did years ago with the mother of Rick Ross's child. But listen to Rick Ross carefully. Rick Ross says 4 songs. Not 1. 4. And there are exactly 4 songs in the Rick Ross catalog that everybody in hip-hop tags as the definitive 50 Cent diss records. Mafia Music. Kiss My Pinky Ring. In Cold Blood. Pushing Him Over the Bridge. 4. Rick Ross is not bragging about a bedroom. Rick Ross is bragging about a body of work. Rick Ross is saying, I didn't take your woman, I took your legacy, and I did it 4 times, and you never recovered. 50 Cent, hearing this, cannot help himself. 50 Cent hops on the internet and starts the routine everybody knows. 50 Cent talks about the elephant on the lawn. 50 Cent asks who mows their own grass. 50 Cent laughs about the John Deere. 50 Cent points at the commercial flight photos and says, look at this rich guy waiting with the junkies. 50 Cent says Rick Ross is trying to jump ahead of a flop. 50 Cent says there is no proper single rollout, no promotion, no Drake, no plan. 50 Cent says Rick Ross is scared. 50 Cent says Rick Ross is washed. 50 Cent says the same sentence 50 Cent has been saying for 15 years. And here's the part 50 Cent will not admit. It's the only material 50 Cent has left. Because when you actually ask 50 Cent, is there anything about Rick Ross you respect? 50 Cent says no, nothing there, never wanted to work with him. And in that same breath, 50 Cent tells the interviewer that Rick Ross's whole career is about mentioning 50 Cent thing about that sentence. 50 Cent is arguing Rick Ross needs 50 Cent to stay relevant, while 50 Cent is on a podcast talking about Rick Ross, unprompted, in 2026. Who is mentioning who? But hold on, because this is where the misdirection sharpens. While the whole planet is watching Rick Ross and 50 Cent trade jabs like it's 2009 all over again, Rick Ross slips a second knife between the ribs of somebody else entirely. Champagne toast just amongst my folks. Rick Ross says it once. Rick Ross doesn't say a name. Rick Ross doesn't have to. Because Drake, the man the culture has called Champagne Poppy for a decade, hears his own nickname sliding across the record and knows exactly who the toast is not for. And right behind that line, Rick Ross drops it again. I've been the nicest since before you got a license. You still biting my rhymes. I could sue you for likeness. Rick Ross is not accusing Drake of stealing a hook. Rick Ross is accusing Drake of stealing an identity, a whole persona, a whole aesthetic. The luxury rap, Rick Ross said in his own words, was the whole ambition of the album, to eat and sound rich. Rick Ross invented the modern flex rap texture that Drake would later scale into a global brand. And Rick Ross is telling Drake, in front of everybody, I could take you to court for how much you sound like me. And then Rick Ross adds a line that turned Twitter into a full-time job for a week. I even wrote a few of your rhymes to show you what it could be. Rick Ross never says whose rhymes. Rick Ross never says what year. Rick Ross never says what song. Rick Ross doesn't need to, because the Ghostwriter conversation has followed Drake around like a shadow for a decade, and Rick Ross knows exactly how to weaponize a shadow. Rick Ross doesn't have to prove the accusation. The accusation proves itself the moment you press play. And if you rewind Stay Schemin', where Drake says a famous line about not being with him shooting in the gym, Rick Ross repeats the same bar right behind Drake on the record. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe Rick Ross has been sitting on that receipt for 14 years, waiting for the exact right moment to cash it. And the moment is now, because Drake's Iceman is charting. Iceman name drops Rick Ross, and prediction markets project Iceman at #1 for over a month. Rick Ross knows Rick Ross cannot outsell Drake. So Rick Ross does the only thing a real veteran can do. Rick Ross outrights Drake. Rick Ross out-narratives Drake. Rick Ross makes a story about the story. And this is where the plot thickens, because Rick Ross does one more thing nobody is talking about loud enough. Rick Ross, on camera, says Rick Ross doesn't want to see Drake lose. Rick Ross says no real one wants to see Drake lose. Rick Ross even confirms that a Drake and Rick Ross joint album is under serious consideration. Real talk, Rick Ross says. Rick Ross just spent an entire album planning the strongest Ghostwriter accusation possible against Drake. And in the same news cycle, Rick Ross is telling the streets Rick Ross and Drake might drop a project together. That is not a contradiction. That is a chess move. Rick Ross is telling Drake, publicly, I own the leverage. I decide if we war. I decide if we work. And whichever one you pick, Drake, I'm going to profit off the choice. Now let's flip the record over, because there's a whole other side of Set in Stone the podcast circuit is undercovering. And this is where Rick Ross gets truly ruthless. Rick Ross reaches back into the darkest chapter of the Rick Ross career, the correctional officer paperwork. The moment 50 Cent in G Unit turned Rick Ross's resume into a punchline, and Rick Ross doesn't dodge it. Rick Ross picks it up and stacks it into a bar. Big fish. Rick Ross calls the CO paperwork a job, a hustle, a position, a reason. Rick Ross says everybody in the streets did what they had to do, and not everybody's resume looks the way it looks in your imagination. That's not defense. That's judo. Rick Ross took the very weapon that was supposed to end the Rick Ross career and turned it into another bar in a verse that will play in strip clubs from Miami to Houston for the next 20 years. That is not a rapper reacting. That is a rapper reversing gravity. And now the deeper cut. Ring around the rose. All these dudes is on the Epstein list. One sentence. No names. And the entire internet spends 48 hours guessing. Is it Jay-Z? Is it Diddy? Is it a music mogul? Is it a fashion mogul? Rick Ross plants a bomb and walks away. Rick Ross does not have to detonate the bomb. Rick Ross just has to make you notice it is there. Because being named in a document is not the same as doing anything wrong. And Rick Ross knows exactly where that legal line sits. And Rick Ross walks along that line like a tightrope artist who has been walking tightropes for 2 decades. And then on the Joe Budden podcast, when the topic of the Jay-Z anniversary concert comes up, Rick Ross gives an answer a lot of viewers describe as short, reserved, almost cold. Rick Ross and Jay-Z, the 2 men who have collaborated for years, suddenly feel a little further apart than the culture has ever noticed. Is that a coincidence? Is that a strategy? Rick Ross is not going to tell you. Rick Ross is going to let you sit with it. Because a rumor Rick Ross does not deny is a rumor that sells a record. Then Rick Ross reaches into the Triple C locker and pulls out Gunplay. Not by name. Never by name. Because Gunplay has spent the last few years on interviews saying things about Rick Ross that fans read as shots. Then Gunplay walks him back. Then the internet remembered the original clips anyway. And Rick Ross, on Set in Stone, drops a bar that basically says, I hear you. I heard all of it. I didn't miss a syllable and I chose not to escalate. That is more powerful than a disc. A disc gives your enemy oxygen. A dismissal takes the oxygen away. Rick Ross is not fighting Gunplay. Rick Ross is dismissing Gunplay. There's a difference, and every rapper listening to Set in Stone understands that difference in their spine. Then Rick Ross drops the DJ Academics reference. Run and ask Academics. He'll tell you who runs a business. And the entire hip-hop internet freezes, because DJ Academics is a Drake-adjacent voice. If you actually ran up to Academics and asked who runs hip-hop right now, based on streams, based on numbers, Academics is very likely to say Drake. So why is Rick Ross telling you to go ask a Drake ally who runs the business? Because Rick Ross is inviting the enemy's judge into the courtroom, knowing the evidence is already stacked. Rick Ross is saying, ask my rival's biggest cheerleader, and even that cheerleader will not be able to argue with the receipts once I put them on the table. And now we get to the coldest lyric on the whole album. Kaso Daddy took the stand and told on his boy. Kaso, the young rapper, whose father, in a real legal proceeding, cooperated with authorities in a case involving Kaso himself. Rick Ross does not soften it. Rick Ross says the quiet street code out loud. Been a rat. Another police on the force. That is Rick Ross drawing a line, and drawing a line in a specific direction, because some listeners point out that Gucci Mane, an artist who has been the subject of similar public debate, appears on the very same album. And that contradiction, whether Rick Ross intended it or not, has become one more talking point keeping Set in Stone at the top of every podcast rundown. Rick Ross's contradiction as content, and contradiction as currency. So let's zoom out. Rick Ross was photographed flying commercial. Rick Ross, the man with the $40 million G600 with the bed, and the paint job, and the custom interior. Rick Ross, in an airport, sitting in a terminal, no security, no assistant, no entourage. And the internet howled. 50 Cent made 3 memes before breakfast. Drake fans clipped it and dropped it into every reply. Rick Ross must be broke. Rick Ross must be flopping. Rick Ross must be ducking Drake, because Iceman is going to eat Set in Stone alive on the Billboard 200. Rick Ross, when asked, said the jet was being updated with Starlink, and Rick Ross flew commercial to link up with Trick Daddy. Everybody laughed. And here is what everybody missed. Rick Ross let them laugh. Rick Ross let 50 Cent cook. Rick Ross let Drake's camp cook. Rick Ross let the reaction podcast cook. Because every meme, every clip, every laugh, every tweet became a free promo cycle for Set in Stone. Rick Ross let the culture roast Rick Ross into the top of the charts. That is not a flop strategy. That is a flip strategy. Rick Ross traded a moment of ego for a month of algorithm, and the algorithm is the only currency that actually matters in 2026. And now the buried lead, the one the reverse engineering unlocks. Every rap feud in the last 20 years ended with one side going quiet and one side going harder. 50 Cent has spent 15 years staying loud about Rick Ross. 15. That is not a beef. That is a subscription. 50 Cent subscribes to Rick Ross. 50 Cent renews the subscription every time Rick Ross drops a record. 50 Cent posts, 50 Cent comments, 50 Cent memes, 50 Cent replies. And Rick Ross, quietly, methodically, keeps releasing. 12 albums deep. Paid before release, according to Rick Ross. Gamma, Larry Jackson. Front money on the table. Rick Ross does not need 50 Cent to sell a record. Rick Ross needs 50 Cent to promote the record for free, and 50 Cent obliges every single time. And 50 Cent has never once figured out that 50 Cent is the unpaid marketing intern in the biggest label deal Rick Ross has ever signed. Same with Drake. Every time Drake mentions Rick Ross on Iceman, on any track, Drake reminds the entire Drake fan base that Rick Ross exists. That Rick Ross is a peer. That Rick Ross is on the mind of the biggest artist in the world. Drake is doing the same free labor for Rick Ross that 50 Cent has been doing for 15 years. And Rick Ross, sitting on 400 acres, mowing that lawn on that John Deere with the AC and the tinted windows and the radio, is laughing all the way to the bank. Because the truth about Set in Stone is that Set in Stone is not an album about beef. Set in Stone is an album about leverage. Every bar is a hand on a lever. Every diss is a rope tied to somebody else's promo cycle. Every rumor Rick Ross refuses to confirm is a subscription Rick Ross refuses to cancel. The disc at Kaso's father is leverage against the loyalty debate. The Epstein bar is leverage against the mogul class. The Gunplay dismissal is leverage against the old crew. The Academics line is leverage against Drake's ecosystem. The Champagne toast is leverage against Drake's brand. The 4 songs line is leverage against 50 Cent's legacy. The commercial flight photo is leverage against everybody who has ever tried to define Rick Ross by an object. Rick Ross is not the boss because Rick Ross owns a jet. Rick Ross is the boss because Rick Ross doesn't need the jet to be the boss. Rick Ross mowing that lawn is Rick Ross telling you, plainly on video, that Rick Ross has already won the game you are still playing. And now the question the culture has to answer. If Set in Stone is not really about 50 Cent, and it's not really about Drake, and it's not really about Gunplay, and it's not really about Kaso, then who is Set in Stone actually about? And this is the answer nobody wants to sit with. Set in Stone is about Rick Ross. About the story Rick Ross is going to leave carved into the concrete when Rick Ross is gone. About the 20 years Rick Ross has already put into the ground. About the fact that when the beef with 50 Cent finally ends and the Drake feud fades and the Gunplay noise cools and the Kaso reference gets buried on the next news cycle, the album will still be there. In stone. That's the whole title. Rick Ross is not competing with Drake or 50 Cent for this week. Rick Ross is competing with a version of Rick Ross that will be talked about in 2046. And on that timeline, in that arena, Rick Ross is already alone. Now here is what nobody is asking. Who is going to answer? 50 Cent will tweet. 50 Cent will meme. 50 Cent will show up on a podcast and say Rick Ross has nothing 50 Cent respects. And 50 Cent has been saying that same sentence in different outfits for 15 years. Drake, if history is any guide, will let the label do the numbers talking. Iceman will sit at number 1. Drake will smile. Drake will not respond in a bar. Because responding in a bar validates the Ghostwriter accusation, and validating the accusation is the one move Drake absolutely cannot make. So Drake stays silent. And silence, in this culture on this record, sounds exactly like guilt to a certain kind of listener. Rick Ross knows this. Rick Ross designed the trap this way. Respond and you lose. Stay silent and you lose slower. That is not a diss track. That is a checkmate on wax. And Gunplay will probably do what Gunplay has been doing. Another interview. Another walk back. Another door left open. Because at the end of the day, Rick Ross said it plainly. Brother door is always open. Come smoke a joint. Come talk. Rick Ross is not closing doors on Set in Stone. Rick Ross is walking through them, while everybody else argues about the locks. And Kaso is young. Kaso has time. Kaso will either respond and get eaten, or Kaso will stay quiet and grow into a different rapper. Rick Ross is not really worried about Kaso. Rick Ross put that bar on the record because the code demanded it. Set in Stone means some things are non-negotiable, and cooperation with authorities is one of them for Rick Ross. So here's what you do next. Go back to Set in Stone. Put on from the top. Caviar intro. Mahogany caskets. Big Fish. Maybach Music 7. Ring Around the Rose. Camel Meat. Every track. And listen this time not for the disc, but for the design. Listen for the leverage. Listen for the receipts. Listen for the moves inside the moves. Listen for the 20 summers Rick Ross has been sharpening this exact chisel. And tell me in the comments right now who really lost this round. Because when the smoke clears from the fake flights and the fake numbers and the fake beefs, Rick Ross is still going to be Rick Ross, Set in Stone. And everybody else is still going to be arguing about a headline Rick Ross wrote for them for free. Drop the biggest bar you noticed, the biggest name you think Rick Ross buried between the lines, and the one prediction you would carve in stone right now about who breaks first. Rick Ross already read it. Rick Ross wrote it. Rick Ross is already in the studio. Rick Ross is already ahead of the room. Rick Ross is already carving. And the stone for Rick Ross is already set clearly already right now for real out loud on record tonight, in public on wax period,